Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Anthony Ruocco will present What Are We Learning About Brain Biology and Borderline Personality Disorder? The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation funds the most innovative ideas in neuroscience and psychiatry to better understand the causes and develop new ways to treat brain and behavior disorders. These disorders include addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, and schizophrenia. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $418 million to fund more than 6,000 grants around the world. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Anthony Ruocco. Dr. Ruocco is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Toronto. He was a 2014 Young Investigator grantee. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. Ruocco's presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the question tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as possible in the time allotted. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Ruocco. Anthony, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for that warm introduction. I'm honored to be invited here today to share the findings of my research on brain biology in borderline personality disorder.
Dr. Ruocco, if you'd be so very kind to move that little GoToWebinar pop-up that you have a little bit where it says click to mute, if you can push it a little bit.
Click to, maybe okay. Is that any better?
No, just leave it like that for now then.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
That's the one, yes, perfect.
Good?
Okay, good.
Okay.
All right, if you can click out of that, show the crisp, maybe you can say no, perfect.
Okay,
good.
Perfect.
Thank
Okay,
you so much.
sorry about that. Again, thank you very much for having me today. Now, before I delve into my research findings, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the generous support of the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation and Families for Borderline Personality Disorder Research. As many of you here today likely already know, BPD and personality disorders more broadly are a highly stigmatized and an understudied form of psychiatric illness. And if it were not for the support of organizations like BBRF and Families for BPD Research, we wouldn't see the research progress that's taken place over the last several years to increase our understanding of BPD. So thank you very much. Now, I'd also like to, before I get into my findings, acknowledge some very important people who contributed in particular to the research funded by BBRF. In particular, Dr. Jeff Daskalakis and Dr. Daniel Bloomberger, who are psychiatrists at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health here in Toronto, who are really instrumental in carrying out our brain stimulation study on BPD. Also, Dr. Shelley McMain, who's the head of the BPD clinic at CAMH here in Toronto, very important for carrying out this research, and Dr. Jenna Trainer and Dr. Nicola Hermanto, postdoctoral fellows, who have really led the way with this research. I'd also like to briefly acknowledge my current and former graduate students. The Sash Bear Foundation, I'll be providing some information about how to visit their website at the end of this presentation. They've been very important for helping to recruit research participants into our research. And of course, the research that I'll be presenting today has been generously supported by BBRF, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Province of Ontario, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So today I'll be covering a number of topics, and I know that we have people here from all around the world, so thank you for joining me. And I know that there were many questions that have come through prior to this presentation. So I hope that I'll be able to answer many of the questions that people had about what borderline personality disorder is. Then we'll get right into brain biology, and in particular, focusing on three main aspects of BPD, those being emotion dysregulation, disturbed relatedness, I'll talk a little bit later about what that is, and then something called behavioral dysregulation. Briefly, I'll talk about some of our new research in my laboratory on stress and neurobiology, and then end with BBRF-funded research on brain stimulation treatment for suicidal ideation and for treatment-resistant depression in people with BPD. So many people ask me, what is borderline personality disorder? Well, the name is one that seems to create a lot of confusion, and rightly so. I think some people have said to me who have received this diagnosis, you know, does this mean I'm at the borderline of having a personality disorder diagnosis? What exactly does this mean? So it gets into, well, what is in a name? So borderline personality disorder, the borderline piece of borderline really comes from borderline representing this kind of boundary zone between two different types of symptoms or syndromes. And it has variously referred to this boundary between psychosis and neurosis, mood disorders and identity disorders, depressive and impulsive syndromes. And so this borderline terminology has kind of stuck with us over time. And the word personality was kind of added into the to the name of BPD by various individuals, especially Otto Kernberg, who talked about something called borderline personality organization. And so we still see remnants of this borderline between psychosis and neurosis, for example, in some of the diagnostic criteria that we have for BPD. But setting aside the specific diagnostic criteria, I just want to emphasize that borderline did represent a boundary zone, and that personality was considered to be especially relevant to the organization of personality, to the presentation of people with what we now know as BPD. And the term borderline personality disorder, it ultimately was added into the diagnostic nomenclature in 1980 with the release of the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, where we talk about borderline personality disorder essentially representing this pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image or identity, and affects or emotions, and marked impulsivity. So in the fifth edition of the diagnostic manual, we still see BPD presenting as a personality disorder that has this kind of pervasive pattern of instability across multiple domains. And in today's presentation, you will see that I'm actually going to be organizing this research along some of these domains. But before we talk about the actual diagnosis of BPD and how this relates to different symptom dimensions that I'll be talking about, I first want to just highlight some of the challenges that we face with diagnosing BPD. The first is that there is not always sufficient time for clinicians to conduct a comprehensive enough assessment of personality disorders. And that sometimes is because people with BPD frequently have other co-occurring psychiatric diagnoses. It could be major depression, substance use disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, or maybe all of these diagnoses. And these can take the initial focus of the attention when a patient presents to a mental health clinician's office. And when an individual's presenting problem is another mental health concern, sometimes BPD and other personality disorders may be overlooked, and it could lead to underdiagnosis. And so we need more attention paid to actually detecting BPD, because if we don't detect BPD, then obviously we can't really address it and determine the best way to treat it. Another important thing to keep in mind is that in the way that we currently diagnose BPD, individuals need to meet 5 of 9 criteria in addition to the general criteria for a personality disorder. Now, we don't really have time to talk about each symptom today so that we can really get into the neurobiology. But what I want to say is that the neurobiology and the research that's done to illuminate neurobiology is really impacted by the way that we diagnose BPD. And so given that we only need 5 of a total of 9 symptoms to be present for a diagnosis of BPD, it's possible that 2 individuals with BPD may have only 1 symptom in common, yet have the same diagnosis. And so given that, it's really important to understand that there are individual differences in how BPD presents. So any one person with BPD can look similar or quite different from another person who has this diagnosis of BPD. So given that, a great deal of research has really been put toward trying to boil the symptom domains of BPD down into what seem to be the core elements of BPD. So we're not going to go through all of these 9 symptoms today. Instead, I want to talk about 3 core symptom domains that have been consistently identified in the scientific literature. The first one is known as emotion dysregulation, and I think it's something that many people have heard before today, that many people consider emotion dysregulation to be one of the core symptom disruptions in people with BPD. And so in the research that I'll be presenting today, you will see that emotion dysregulation is really one of the key things that I will be discussing from a neurobiological perspective. Another symptom dimension that has been described is called disturbed relatedness. And this covers symptoms related to being having a hard time understanding oneself, so identity, but also interpersonal problems. We know a lot about BPD, and people with BPD often have this hypersensitivity to rejection. And so we'll be talking a little bit about disturbed relatedness, but unfortunately, we have less information from a neurobiological perspective about this specific symptom domain, but I'll be talking about some emerging research that I think many people might find interesting. Finally, we'll talk about behavioral dysregulation, which refers to the impulse control symptoms that people with BPD often experience. And we often also see intersections across these different domains. So for example, people who experience high emotion dysregulation might have difficulties regulating their behaviors when they're feeling especially dysregulated. And that constant up and down in emotions could lead to difficulties understanding oneself because of these constant changes driven by emotions. I also want to acknowledge that even though I'll be talking about neurobiology, I don't want everybody to kind of see these as factors that cannot be changed. There are many factors that can cause and maintain BPD. On the one hand, we can talk about environmental factors, and in today's presentation, I'll be speaking a little bit more about the role of stress in the neurobiology of BPD. And what's consistently identified in the research literature is that people with BPD have a childhood history of trauma or maltreatment. But unfortunately, at this point in time, for good reason, we don't yet know whether there's a causal link between this childhood trauma or maltreatment and the development of BPD. But what we do know is that there is a link there. We also know that the symptoms of BPD are quite highly heritable. So we can see these running in families with BPD. And one way to potentially link environment with genetics and neurobiology in people with BPD is that there is some early evidence to suggest that there are epigenetic changes, so changes that occur to the genes that may be linked to experiences of childhood maltreatment. So we can start to see how environment can actually make an impression on genes and affect biology. So let's talk in more detail then about the brain biology of borderline personality disorder. I'm going to start out by talking about emotion dysregulation, which refers to a number of different symptoms of BPD that essentially refer to people with BPD having really wild shifts in emotion from one moment to the other, usually lasting hours. We also see difficulties with anger, constant feelings of anger, including outbursts. And so what does emotion dysregulation look like in people with BPD? Well, one way that we can actually study emotion dysregulation in BPD is to study what strategies people with BPD use to regulate their emotions. And there's a great deal of research to study the different strategies that people with BPD can use to regulate their emotions. In research that we published a few years ago now, we actually looked at people with BPD and studied these strategies that people tend to associate as being more maladaptive, known as suppression, rumination, and avoidance. And we also looked at strategies that tend to be more adaptive in the long run, so helpful in the long run. These are known as cognitive reappraisal, problem solving, and acceptance. What we found is that people with BPD tend to engage in certain emotion regulation strategies that tend not to be very useful in the long run. These are things like trying to actively suppress one's emotions, ruminating, so excessively focusing on emotions, and avoidance at the kind of cognitive level, being unwilling to experience emotions. And unfortunately, even though these strategies tend to be more helpful in the long run, people with BPD tend to engage in cognitive often. This is a form of emotion regulation that involves trying to kind of think about a situation in a different way, maybe focusing on the positive things that might come out of a potentially troubling situation. Problem solving, coming up with solutions to a problem, and hopefully being able to focus on actually achieving that solution to be able to experience more positive emotional outcomes. And acceptance, which really again refers to this notion of non-judgmental awareness and acceptance of emotions. So this might be some of the reasons, these strategies might be some of the reasons that we see such frequent difficulties with emotion regulation in people with BPD. And why this might matter is that we found in our analyses that higher use of rumination and lower problem solving were each associated with people with BPD engaging in potentially harmful behaviors, such as self-harm and substance use, among other things. So one thing that we've studied in our research, and I think it's especially relevant to families, given the Families for BPD research context of today's presentation, is that we've actually studied families where one individual in the family has BPD, and we've also looked at so people who have BPD, their first-degree relatives, and some controls who don't have a history of psychiatric illness. And in this study, we're actually able to look at, do these types of difficulties run in families? That maybe gives us some indication of the role of familial risk and maybe genetic and biological risks to BPD. We found that certain psychiatric diagnoses seem to be more prevalent in, or quite highly prevalent, not only in people with BPD, but also their families. And consistent with this idea that we see high levels of emotion dysregulation in people with BPD, we see diagnoses that are associated with emotion dysregulation more common in people with BPD, such as major depression, and in their relatives. We also see a relatively high prevalence of social anxiety disorder, more of an interpersonally relevant disorder, alcohol dependence, which is more related, we think, to impulse control, and trauma and stress related disorders in people with BPD and their relatives. So all of this really gives us some confidence that emotion regulation, alongside the other things we'll talk about later today, such as impulse control and interpersonal functioning, stress and neurobiology, all these things might actually be relevant not only to people with BPD, but also the familial risk to BPD. And in this family study, we specifically looked at whether people in families also experience emotion dysregulation if they're related to somebody with BPD. And we won't go into the details, but I want to highlight that both people with BPD and their relatives report feeling embarrassed or guilty when feeling upset. They report problems concentrating, feeling out of control, and having a hard time finding a way to feel better when they're upset, suggesting that difficulties with emotion regulation might actually be transmitted to some extent in families. We don't know just yet how much of this is maybe related to genetics versus environment, but it does suggest that this is something that is of concern in families with BPD. So let's talk about neurobiology now. The theory of emotion dysregulation in BPD is that the neural systems that are involved in representing the intensity of emotions might be dysregulated and hypersensitive to emotional experience. and that might be tied with this idea that people with BPD have difficulty regulating emotions, and that would be represented perhaps in less activation in brain regions that are involved in regulating emotion. And in research that we published several years ago now, we actually collapsed information, aggregated data across multiple studies to determine what the brain correlates are of people with BPD compared to healthy controls, while people are processing or examining negative emotional information. So by that, I'm referring to things like faces that are showing an angry or a neutral facial expression. An angry facial expression compared to a neutral facial expression. And in this research where we're comparing these negative emotional materials to neutral emotional materials, we found, consistent with this idea of a hypersensitivity to emotions, that people with BPD on average tend to show higher activation in a brain region called the insular cortex. And that brain region, funny enough, happens to be activated in association with how intensely somebody subjectively experiences emotion. So this might be a neural basis for this hypersensitivity to emotion. On the other hand, we do also see less activation in regions of the brain that are associated with the more effortful control of emotion, the regulation of emotion. And what this suggests is perhaps there is support for this notion at the biological level in the brain that there's a hypersensitivity to emotional experience and a difficulty with the regulation of that emotional experience. And I'll ask everybody to keep this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in mind because we'll be referring to that brain region when we talk about the parts of the brain that are stimulated in our BBRF-funded study. Now, I talked about neutral faces and neutral information being the comparison in this research, in comparison to things like angry or fearful faces. And one big question that has been studied for several years now is, are neutral faces really neutral for people with BPD? It's not uncommon when I was running my family study here in Toronto of people with BPD, that family members would say to me, you know, I am talking to my family member who has BPD, and even though I think I have a neutral facial expression, the person thinks that I'm angry at them or disappointed in them, or they think that I'm upset, and I think I have a kind of an emotionless expression. I'm not sure what they're reading into. And so this has been studied in the scientific literature. And so what the theory is that was proposed by Lynch in 2006 is that maybe people with BPD have better emotion recognition, better ability to see emotions in faces when these emotions are presented at a lower level of intensity. So when that emotional expression is more subtle. And on the other hand, maybe when people with BPD are viewing emotional faces that are very highly, intensely emotional, for whatever reason, they have difficulty really trying to decipher that emotional expression, and they tend to see other emotional expressions in these extremely intense faces. And what this suggests is that maybe there is something we need to consider in our brain imaging research that is going on with neutral faces. So in research that I carried out and published actually this year in the Journal of Affective Disorders, I worked with colleagues in Switzerland who tested patients who were in an inpatient program for people with BPD, and we examined brain activation for neutral facial expressions in BPD to understand maybe there's something unique to how people with BPD are actually perceiving neutral, what we think people who don't have BPD think as neutral faces. So we also studied faces that are 50% fearful and 100% fearful. So what did we find? At least at what we call a whole brain level, examining activation across the whole brain, when we compare people, these inpatients with BPD, to controls, we find that there are no significant differences between people with BPD and controls in terms of levels of brain activation associated with 50% fearful faces. We also see no significant differences on the 100%, the highly intense fearful expressions. And interestingly, where we see the greater differences are in neutral facial expressions, and in particular, an area of activation within the amygdala, where we see higher activation in people with BPD compared to controls in this region that we also think tends to be activated when people need to pay attention to important stimuli in their environment. So what this suggests to us potentially is that perhaps people with BPD don't simply interpret neutral facial expressions as kind of non-threatening or kind of not important to pay attention to. Instead, maybe people with BPD have some type of differences in how they perceive purportedly neutral information, and maybe see an ambiguous facial expression as something that they need to pay attention to, maybe because it could potentially be threatening. So this research suggests that we can't only focus on facial expressions in our neurobiological research that actually display negative emotional expressions. We also need to look at expressions that are more ambiguous and try to understand how people with BPD perceive those expressions. One of the other major questions that I get when I'm presenting my research in different venues is many people who maybe are parents who have BPD and they're thinking about their children, maybe their adolescent children who are starting to potentially show some signs of BPD. People wonder, do we see the same types of brain differences in adolescents who have BPD traits compared to adults? So do we see some kind of parallels between adults and adolescents in their levels of brain activation? What we found in this study that was carried out in conjunction with the Hospital for Sick Children here in Toronto, we looked at adolescents between 13 and 17 years old who reported higher levels of BPD traits, and we compared these individuals to controls who don't have BPD. They completed a brain imaging scan called magnetoencephalography, which allowed us to examine how different brain regions connect to each other, how strongly, especially these emotional brain regions, connect to each other. What we found was when people with BPD traits and controls were examining angry facial expressions, that there was actually less connectivity between the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex, which overall we think might be a circuit of brain regions that's involved in emotion perception and regulation. And actually overall, if we look at this graph on the right side of the screen, we see that overall levels of connectivity were actually much lower in people with BPD compared to healthy controls. So overall, what this suggests is that we might see some parallel findings in adolescents with BPD, and this might be an important finding to follow up to understand how do these potentially change as people's personality develops into adulthood. So I'd like to change gears now and talk about disturbed relatedness. It's kind of separated out on this slide because we know much less compared to the other two symptom domains, but still I think it's important to cover what we do know because I think it helps to illuminate the types of interpersonal difficulties that we see in people with BPD. So quickly, I just want to review that this question has been posed, are neutral faces really neutral for people with BPD? We were very interested in studying this question and understanding this in people with BPD. And what we found in this study, where we were able to aggregate research findings across multiple studies, we found that people with BPD make more errors in recognizing highly arousing negative emotional expressions. These include anger and disgust. And disgust is an interesting finding in the sense that we know people with BPD are very sensitive to rejection on average. The average person tends to be somewhat sensitive to rejection. And disgust is an emotional expression that signifies rejection. So not surprising here. But what was especially interesting in this research was that people with BPD tend to see other expressions, whether it's a happy expression, a sad expression, what have you, in what are supposed to be, I say that quote unquote, because maybe they aren't showing neutral expressions, but at least people who don't have a history of psychiatric illness do not see these expressions as having an emotion in them. They are perceived as neutral. So it kind of suggests that people with BPD might be quite sensitive to even subtle expressions of emotion. And we have studied this in families in a study that is currently in press in the Journal of Personality Disorders, we found that people with BPD are indeed less accurate at identifying neutral faces compared to relatives and controls. So as you can see on this slide here, we have the percent correct of in terms of the faces that are shown to people with BPD, their relatives and controls. People with BPD, also known as probands in family studies, are the green bars. They are the least accurate, not terribly inaccurate, but they are lower than relatives, who are yellow, and controls, who are blue. But thinking back to this notion that maybe there is something unique to BPD that has to do with perceiving expressions as more threatening, we found that people with BPD respond slower to sad facial expressions when they need to figure out what emotion is in these faces. And that's not just people with BPD. When they're looking at sad emotional expressions, they're slower to figure out that it's sad, but their relatives are also slower. Interestingly, we also found that both relatives and people with BPD are more likely to perceive sad faces as fearful faces. Again, getting back to this notion that maybe emotionally speaking, people with BPD are perhaps more likely or more inclined than people without BPD. And this is also including their relatives here. They might be more inclined to see more threatening emotional content in faces that are not intended, at least, to display threatening expressions. Now, thinking about more of the rejection sensitivity that has been described in people with BPD, we have studied something called a Cyberball task. It's a task for studying what has been described as interpersonal ostracism. On this task, which is a computerized task, somebody is with BPD or control is put into a scanner, a magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and they can see a screen, and they're shown this kind of strange set of figures. And the person or the avatar at the bottom of the screen is the participant, the person with BPD or a control. And on this task, during what we call a control condition, people with BPD and controls are told that they're watching two other players who are playing a ball tossing game. And so they're told that they're not connected to the internet, so they can't actually toss the ball to the two other players. Instead, they just need to watch them toss the ball between the two people. Then what we do is we see what happens when we actually include the person in the ball tossing game. And this is the inclusion condition, where the person with BPD or the control is fully involved in this ball tossing game because you're now connected to the internet. And as you might imagine, when we're interested in ostracism or exclusion from the ball tossing game, we have an exclusion condition where the player is then completely excluded despite being connected to the internet. And we have used this task, and many other researchers have also used this task to understand what are the neural correlates of feeling socially excluded or rejected in people with BPD. But before we talk about the brain level, I think it's important to highlight that although in our research we didn't see significant differences in how excluded people actually felt during this task, we had people with BPD, controls, we measured their feelings of belongingness in the inclusion condition. The people with BPD did report feeling less included in the interaction during the inclusion condition, but not statistically significantly so. But I highlight this because other research has actually suggested that people with BPD, even when they're being included in this ball tossing game and in other types of interpersonal situations, they still report this feeling that they are not as included in the interaction. And in fact, research suggests that in order for people with BPD to actually feel the level of inclusion that our controls experience, even when they're being included in the interaction, you actually need to over-include them in the interaction in order for them to feel that same level of inclusivity, which again gets at this idea that people with BPD might be hypersensitive to rejection. But some of this we need to think about, how does this relate to the stigma that people with BPD experience, and how might it reinforce their social perceptions of being not included in society and in social interactions? But setting that issue aside, It's important to highlight, though, that at the brain level, we see higher levels of activation in the frontal cortex, especially parts of the frontal cortex that are involved in what we call mentalizing. So people with BPD might be especially focused, at least based on their neural correlates, on the interaction and trying to understand what is going on in somebody else's mind. And this is also paired with increased activity during social exclusion in the anterior cingulate cortex, which in early research was thought to represent kind of social pain that people experience. So one potential interpretation is that this higher anterior cingulate cortex activity might actually represent greater kind of feelings of social pain. Now we're going to move on to behavioral dysregulation. Again, we're referring to symptoms of impulsivity. And as a neuropsychologist, somebody who studies cognition or thinking abilities, I'm especially drawn to talk a little bit more about neurocognition more broadly before we talk on more specifically about the cognitive functions that are involved in behavioral regulation. So the first thing I want to highlight, because this comes up a lot when I give presentations, is that there is a link between BPD and ADHD. And that's not surprising because people with BPD report significant difficulties with attention and working memory, or the ability to kind of keep things in mind for short periods of time. We also see a link between BPD and learning disorders, a whole range of learning disorders, which is not surprising because we see deficits. They can differ, of course, from one person to another, but we do see limitations in learning and memory ability, kind of spatial abilities, language proficiency, just general speed, and executive functions, which are very relevant to ADHD and learning disorders. Executive functions is a term that is used kind of as an umbrella, referring to the types of cognitive or thinking skills that are needed to be able to kind of successfully navigate the environment, to regulate one's behaviors, especially in situations that may be less structured. In BPD families, we tend to see high levels of inattention reported, and especially inattention that is linked to problems with impulse control. And in this family study, we actually found that both people with BPD and their relatives report higher levels of inattention compared to controls. And when we asked people with BPD and their relatives about their neurodevelopmental histories, we found that they were both more frequently reporting having difficulties concentrating and sitting still in school, and minor detentions at and suspensions from school. All of this kind of coming together to suggest that in people with BPD, and potentially people who are at a familial risk to BPD, that we might see important links with attention and self-regulation. Briefly, I want to say that I've also studied what types of cognitive thinking ability deficits we see in people with BPD. The two greatest deficits, although we see deficits across the board, the two greatest deficits are in visual memory, which will be very relevant when I talk in just a few moments about our research on stress and neurobiology. But we also see great deficits in planning ability. And so what this suggests is that people with BPD do have a greater difficulty kind of generating solutions to problems and implementing them effectively, which not surprisingly can lead to decisions that are sometimes problematic and lead to potentially harmful behaviors. I'm not going to go into the details of this slide other than to say that we have also studied how these deficits that I've been talking about are associated with trauma in BPD. That is one of the common questions that I received prior to this presentation. And not surprisingly, when we studied this in collaboration with colleagues in Denmark, we found that childhood physical abuse was associated with more severe deficits in adults with BPD in terms of their verbal comprehension. We also found in the subset of patients with BPD who also had post-traumatic stress disorder, they performed worse on tests of verbal comprehension, on memory, and in perceptual reasoning. And you'll see in a moment why we think memory is so important to consider when it comes to studying the neurobiology of stress and its effects on BPD. We've also studied how it is that impulse control is represented in the brain, including in families with BPD. Briefly, we used a brain imaging technology that actually shines light, infrared light, onto the brain so we can measure activation, how much oxygenation is occurring in the outer levels of the brain or outer layer of the brain. We use a task where we simply ask somebody to look at a computer screen while their brain is being imaged, and we ask them to press the space bar every time they see a green circle pop up on the screen. We also tell them when they see a red circle, which is far less frequent, they need to not press the space bar. So they need to inhibit their behavior. So on this task, which is also known as a go, no-go task, we have found that probands, which are people with BPD, this is 86 people with BPD on the far left of your screen, when they're asked to inhibit their behavior on this simple task, people with BPD actually show less activation across the prefrontal cortex compared to controls and relatives. And we expected that relatives would show similar levels of lower activation in the prefrontal cortex compared to their family members who have BPD. What we found instead in 60 relatives who, again, have a relative who has BPD, but who themselves don't have BPD, we found that there was actually this hyperactivation, this higher level of activation in the prefrontal cortex. And this was unexpected. What we interpret this finding as is maybe a compensatory mechanism, that the brain is actually activating more so compared to somebody who doesn't have BPD and doesn't have a relative with BPD in order to be able to inhibit their responses on our task. So maybe relatives with BPD need to activate the prefrontal cortex even more so by virtue of their relative having BPD and there perhaps being this familial risk to less efficient activation of the prefrontal cortex that we need for impulse control. We've also used this task to understand how the effects of treatments like dialectical behavior therapy might relate to brain activation. So in this study that was funded by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, it was a relatively small study of, I believe, 29 patients who had BPD and who were also engaging in self-harm. What we found is that after people underwent 7 months of dialectical behavior therapy, which is a therapy that's especially directed toward helping people to regulate their behaviors and their emotions, we found that self-harm over at least 7 months of treatment significantly reduced. It might look as though cutting increased from pre-treatment to 7 months of treatment. That was entirely driven by 2 patients who actually increased their levels of self-harm, specifically cutting, quite dramatically over the form of treatment. But across the whole group and across all forms of self-harm, we saw a reduction. But this finding that some people actually increase their self-harm was quite interesting to us. So we wanted to understand what are the neural correlates that might differentiate between people who benefit from 7 months of DBT versus those who don't when it comes to self-harm. So we divided people up into groups. The yellow group is the group that really didn't do well, at least with 7 months of DBT. And you can see them on this graph here as prior to beginning treatment, they actually showed low levels of activation in the prefrontal cortex when they were asked to inhibit their behaviors. And after 7 months of treatment, we see essentially no change in activation in these impulse control centers. You can compare that with the group that showed a high improvement in self-harm. They significantly, substantially reduced their self-harm through treatment. What we found in this group was that they showed the lowest levels of activation in these impulse control regions prior to beginning treatment, and after 7 months of treatment showed the greatest gains in activation. And this pattern of activation was replicated across both the left and right prefrontal cortex. So what this suggests is that before somebody even engages in treatment, there might be patterns of brain activation in the prefrontal cortex that are related to behavioral dysregulation that could be used to tell us who are the best candidates for treatment. And this is really important to try to reduce the wait list for these very intensive treatments. So I know this was a lot of information, but I'd like to just highlight a few things that are kind of hot off the press, new findings from our research to better understand what the source might be of these neurobiological differences that we see in BPD. And one of the main things that we focused on more recently is how stress plays a role in neurobiology and BPD. In our research, we focused especially on a brain region called the hippocampus. Some people might be familiar with this region. It's a region of the brain that's involved in two key processes. One of them is learning and memory, so learning new information and being able to retain that information and then recall it later. But it's also involved in the regulation of stress hormones. And so it is kind of at the center of these different processes that are really relevant to the types of deficits and difficulties we see in people with BPD, but also other forms of psychiatric illness, for example, depression. And what's unique about the hippocampus is that stress plays a really important role in how the hippocampus actually functions. In fact, stress, which we can describe as experiences that are arousing, aversive, uncontrollable, stress actually over time appears to actually cause the hippocampus to shrink. And that might happen perhaps due to how stress is altering the hippocampus, which then alters how stress hormones are regulated. And not surprisingly, in research that has examined how stress interacts with stress hormones and the hippocampus and learning and memory, we see that that stress is associated with lower hippocampal sizes and deficits in learning and memory. And we're interested in, well, how does this play out in the context of mental illness, especially BPD and depression? I won't go into the details of how we did this study in the interest of time, but what I'll say is that people did go into an MRI scanner and they completed a task where they were asked to look at scenes in the scanner and decide whether the scene that was presented to them was an indoor scene or an outdoor scene. So pretty simple task. Little did they know that after they did this task for quite a long time in the scanner, when they came out of the scanner, they had to complete a surprise memory test. And we asked them to decide whether they remembered or not the scenes that they were presented in the scanner. And then we can go back and look at what brain activation looked like to the scenes that they remembered versus the scenes that they forgot. What we found was that in controls, in controls, what we found is that there was that the higher the level of activation when somebody was remembering versus forgetting a scene, that was actually associated, as expected, with the proportion of scenes that were recalled. So the higher the activation, the better the memory. That was what we found in controls. In people with BPD, we almost saw the opposite pattern. And what we found was that the difference in the correlations between these two groups was actually quite different. And we also saw that BPD was associated with high stress, at least in the last month that people reported on. So we thought, what does this look like across the lifetime? How does stress across one's lifetime impact brain activation? And by the way, we're talking, specifically here about activation in the hippocampus. So we, in a study that is not yet published, we looked at how stress across the lifetime. So this includes stress associated with relationship problems, stress associated with work and school, childhood trauma, all sorts of things. If we kind of aggregate all this information and understand how stress has impacted somebody across their life, we found that over the course of one's life, the more stress somebody experienced, the lower their size of the hippocampus. And we saw this in a group that was comprised of people who had BPD, depression, as well as controls. And we took this a step further to understand how does the brain activate when it's involved in a memory task, but how does this activation during memory relate to cumulative stress? And what you can see on this slide is that the blue blobs represent the lower activation during a memory task in people with BPD, with depression and controls, lower activation associated with cumulative stress on a memory task, essentially suggesting that cumulative stress seems to be impacting how much the brain can activate when it's engaging in memory. And we saw this also specifically in the hippocampus, that the greater the amount of cumulative stress, we see this associated with lower activation in hippocampus when somebody is trying to remember things. And so we've also found evidence to suggest that not only is personality disorder symptoms like BPD symptoms associated with less hippocampal activation during memory processing, we also found that cumulative stress might at least partially explain why the hippocampus is deactivating, not functioning as strongly as it should be during memory processes. So this is some initial evidence to suggest that there is some intricate relationship between how stress impacts the brain and then how that brain activation and deactivation in this case might relate to personality disorders. I'm going to end with our study on brain stimulation in BPD, where we're trying to see, can we use what we know about the brain in BPD to inform treatments? And I mentioned earlier that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is especially relevant to emotions in people with BPD. And in this study that was funded by the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, we actually tested for the first time to our knowledge the potential effects of magnetic seizure therapy on suicidal ideation and depression in people with BPD. So what is MST? So it actually induces seizures by applying magnetic stimulation to the brain, as you can see here. And it might actually be an alternative to electroconvulsive therapy. And it's provided under general anesthesia, so the person is not awake while the person is undergoing this treatment. So it is an innovative treatment, and it has demonstrated safety and efficacy for treatment-resistant unipolar and bipolar depression. And as I said a moment ago, it could be a safer alternative to electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. The reason is that ECT compared to MST actually might produce greater amnesia, so memory difficulties, based on kind of how that treatment works. So MST might be kind of a safer and effective alternative for people who are experiencing depression. So in our study, we were interested in determining whether MST might actually be useful for treating especially suicidal ideation as well as depression in people with BPD. And we think it might be effective because there is some research that suggests that it might be useful in particular for reducing suicidal ideation when this stimulation is applied to what I've described earlier, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And until now, MST hasn't been studied in people who have both treatment-resistant depression and BPD. So we conducted this pilot investigation of the safety and feasibility of this treatment for suicidal patients with BPD. We compared two treatment arms. In one arm, people underwent MST plus what is typically the treatment for the borderline personality disorder clinic here in Toronto at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. That is dialectical behavior therapy. And we compared this to people who underwent DBT alone. And we compared symptom, neuropsychological, and brain imaging outcomes in both arms. We recruited 19 patients with BPD who are currently depressed. They all reported very severe depression and moderate to severe suicidal ideation. So these are people who are experiencing quite severe depression and thoughts of suicide. And they also had failed to achieve really an adequate clinical response to antidepressant medications during their current depressive episode. So we screened 62 people. I won't go through the details of the study design, but essentially people self-selected into one of these arms to get MST or DBT only. And then we completed neuropsychological testing, baseline testing, and a brain imaging scan. People underwent up to 5 weeks of the treatment, and then we did post-symptom assessments, including a 4-month follow-up to see if this treatment is actually effective over the short term, let's say 5 weeks of treatment. Is it still effective at keeping symptoms at bay after 4 months? What we found is that there were significant changes in depression severity in the in the MST arm compared to the DBT only arm. What you can see on this slide is that the blue bars represent the patients who underwent psychotherapy only, and then those who underwent psychotherapy plus the brain stimulation treatment. So we saw a significant reduction in symptoms in depression severity, but unfortunately we didn't see these sustained at the 4-month follow-up. So it suggests potentially that this treatment could be effective for people with BPD who we know are quite often experiencing severe depression symptoms, that maybe this treatment could be effective, at least in the short term, for reducing depression severity. And maybe even more importantly, we see more robust effects on suicidal ideation. In particular, as you can see on this slide, the red bars on the graph represent the brain stimulation treatment. We see significant reductions from pre-treatment to post-treatment in suicidal ideation severity, and we see these gains maintained over 4 months of follow-up. And so I think these are really important initial findings. It was a very intensive treatment study, but the benefits might be very important, because if we actually see significant reductions in suicidal ideation that might be sustained after 4 months of follow-up, we could significantly reduce the risk potentially of suicide in people who are actively thinking about suicide and who have BPD. We also examined changes in cognitive functioning. So we talked about memory and executive functions and speed previously in people with BPD. We see the darker green bars represent pre-treatment, the lighter green bars represent post-treatment. And what we see is that there are no significant differences. If anything, we see increases, kind of improvements in cognition after the MST treatment. So this is good because it suggests potentially that it's a safe treatment for people with BPD. I'm going to end by saying that we are continuing in the future to study suicide in people with BPD, especially understanding biomarkers of decision-making that might place people at risk for suicide attempt in people with BPD. We're also trying to really systematically review the literature on how brain stimulation treatments might improve suicide-related outcomes in people with BPD, but also people with different forms of psychiatric illness. And one thing that people may be less familiar with is that there are changes that are happening in terms of how we're going to be diagnosing personality disorders, at least in the World Health Organization's forthcoming 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases. The different diagnoses that we currently see in the DSM, such as borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, are proposed, at least in this diagnostic system, to be replaced with a single personality disorder diagnosis. And it's based on dysfunction in self and interpersonal functioning, which I described earlier as this disturbed relatedness. There will be a continuation of BPD in the sense that there will be an optional borderline pattern qualifier. And I just want to present a final slide showing that we've begun to study this alternative diagnosis, this new diagnosis of personality disorder with colleagues in Switzerland, and have begun to see that in people who have BPD and often other personality disorders, that regions of the brain that are involved in emotion regulation seem to be hyper-connected in association with the types of disturbed relatedness symptoms that we have talked about previously. So we might be able to start to also apply our research findings on the neurobiology of BPD to this new personality disorder diagnosis that is forthcoming. So I will end by saying thank you to everybody for taking the time out today to listen to my presentation. If you're interested in learning more about my laboratory and the research that we do, including signing up for our research registry, where we can contact people who might be qualifying for future research studies, you can visit www.clinicalneurosciences.ca. And many people were asking about BPD resources that people can access after this presentation. There are a number of them. This is a small subset of them. The first, of course, is Families for BPD Research, the Stash Bear Foundation, the National Education Alliance BPD, TARA for BPD, and Emotions Matter. So please feel free to take a look at these websites for more information. So thank you very much again for having me today, and thank you again to BBRF and Families for BPD Research for supporting my research on BPD.
Dr. Ruocco, I have to say thank you for an outstanding research on research presentation on complicated issues, and thank you for the research that you've been doing. It provides tremendous hope for the future for better treatments for BPD. And I can't thank you enough. You've covered, as we said before we started, just in our own conversation, that you knew a number of questions. You covered a lot of the questions that came in. So we won't have Q&A today, but I'm just saying to you, thank you so much for all that you're doing for this important condition. So thank you. I also want to thank everybody who joined us today for our presentation. The 100% of all contributions for research are invested in our grants to scientists. All of the research we fund is made possible through supporters like you. So please consider making a gift by visiting bbrfoundation.org or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion or would like to share it with family and friends, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. I hope you'll join us again next month when Dr. Amanda McCleary, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the University of Iowa, will present Cognitive Impairment in Psychosis, what it is and how it's treated. This webinar will take place on Tuesday, July 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, thank you for joining us. Take care.